All right, cool. Well, I feel very at home on this stage. To give a little background on myself real quick, I am a musical theater actress turned engineer, so this venue feels very much like a home to me. I've actually never been to Kansas City before. This is my very first time here. But the only exposure that I had to Kansas City was the musical Oklahoma. Does anyone know what I'm talking about? Yeah, okay. So there's a song in the Rodgers and Hammerstein's musical Oklahoma called Everything's Up to Date in Kansas City. And I believe the character Will Parker leaves Oklahoma, goes to Kansas City. Everything's like super technologically advanced and it's super exciting. So he sings a song about it. So it's very ironic that I'm here at a tech conference. So it's kind of like full circle, right? So hi everyone, my name is Condon. I am a developer evangelist at CodeFresh. Today I'm going to be talking about modern CI/CD with containers. So containers have really kind of changed our entire scope of automation, and one of the implications that is that you should stop using the staging server, and I'll get into the air quotes in just a second. So I know it's a bold statement, but I really mean it, and at CodeFresh we really mean it too. So the intention of kind of what I want you to walk away from this talk thinking about differently is giving you a new perception on how to view your staging server and view your staging environment. Sort of this idea of shifting to the left. I guess left for you guys if I'm standing up here is this way. So for quite some time, we've been implementing CI/CD using a staging server, and the staging server has served as a very meaningful part of our pipelines. But what I'd like to show you today is, given all of our latest technologies and with the rise of containers, we can actually kind of rethink our pipeline and rethink the way that we do continuous integration and continuous delivery. And in fact, we can make it much faster and streamlined. So before we dive in, a little bit about me. I live in the Bay Area, and I help organize the Containers 101 meetup group. So if you're ever in the Bay Area, definitely check us out. I'm a developer as well as an advocate and a mentor for women in tech. And I'm the developer evangelist at CodeFresh, and I'm a blogger about all things container, Docker, diversity related. Also, coming from a theater background, I really love when people laugh at my jokes and like nod along and interact. So like, you are free to laugh at me this whole presentation. Feel free to add me on Twitter, find me on Medium. I always get asked what my favorite roles were in musicals, so I added this slide. My two favorites were Hairspray, that's me up there, and Xanadu, the musical. And there's a lot of fun things to YouTube out there of me if you get bored sometime. And you're probably thinking, where do I recognize this girl from? It's not from these musicals, unless you've ever been in San Francisco. I actually recently wrote this article called What It's Like to Be a Woman at a Tech Conference, so I'm that girl. It's a really humorous, fun approach to kind of the experience of being a woman in this industry, and I highly encourage you to read it if that's something that you're interested in. But I will get started with my talk now. So a little bit about CodeFresh before I get started. We are a Docker native CI/CD, and we've really been working with containers from day one. So we know all the pain points and the frustrations that Docker users have run into when doing their CI/CD. So we're really built with those users in mind. So here's a little mini agenda of what I'm going to be covering today. First, I'm going to be talking about common CI/CD implementations and the challenges that we run into with those implementations. And then I'm going to go into containers and their impact on traditional CI/CD. So let's get started. So you guys have pretty much seen this before. This is a pretty common Git flow. You would create a branch, work on the changes, and when you submit those changes, the only thing the person doing the code review really knows is maybe that it passed all your tests. But this doesn't tell them the changes are functional. You have to wait until they get into staging to run the deeper level of testing, integration, performance, security, et cetera, et cetera. So we're actually doing kind of the bulk of that once we get to the staging server. So why can't we do all that testing until we get into staging? Well, because we don't actually have our application running until we get to staging, right? So the model has serious drawbacks. The point being, when it hits staging in sort of the traditional way of continuous integration, it's hitting a much broader set of tests. And that's where we start running not only the unit test, integration tests, UI tests, performance, Selenium, and in some cases, manual tests to our code much later. So if we look at this sort of slightly different timeline, this is the same thing but on a different graph here, you'll see we're working on our feature branch and making a pull request, but at staging, and that's where all the heavy lifting is taking place. And on this timeline, you'll also see kind of on the bottom part here, and of course, this is approximated, but the further along in the process that we're at, the more expensive it is. And the more costly it is for us to fix these issues. So if we find some issues while we're working on our feature branch, it's much easier to incorporate those changes and to make those fixes. The later we find it, the more expensive, the more costly it is, and the more time-consuming it is for the team. So what are the deliverables? Another aspect of the traditional way that we develop and we implement with continuous integration is that sort of handshake that we have between development and deployment. So a typical handshake will be a label, a stamp in the code base, test reports, results, sometimes proposed changes to the database, and a list of known issues. So we want to communicate that as part of the release notes. So what are the challenges? I've touched on a few, but I'm just going to dive into a couple that we usually see. So first, we're all familiar with the lovely somebody broke staging Slack message that we've all received at one time or the other. Maybe you've broke staging before, you've been in a situation where you've had to wait on it. So this is frustrating for the whole team. Even more so for the developer who changed the code and broke staging for everyone else. So that's likely to happen when we implement a process in which our code changes are being tested for UI and integration at the staging environment for the very first time. And in this case, as a developer, this is the very first time that people are seeing my feature up against the main branch at staging. And this scenario is incredibly frustrating. I know when I'm usually given feedback, I want to be able to take that feedback and apply that feedback immediately. Maybe that's the actress in me getting direction, wanting to perform it immediately. But I don't know when these changes are going to be added. Usually the mentality is it's at staging, let's just push it and we can fix it in the next iteration. I don't know when I'll have time to do that. I don't know if I have the time to reprioritize that. So I'd much rather be able to implement that feedback now versus later. And lastly, we have the frictions, which is a great segue into containers. So there's always frictions between different development environments, staging environments, production environments, and the issues usually stem from these differences and not the code base itself. So that's where we have some flows in the process that can be very time consuming. And we need to figure out why these issues are happening. So eventually we find out sometimes the issues weren't about the code, they were actually about some sort of environmental variable that we didn't have in each environment. So I love this comic. I think this is a nice summary of sort of what it's like to be an engineer. Before I go into a little bit more on containers, the main issue here is that code changes and pull requests are being tested for much more extensively and for the first time in staging and not earlier in the life cycle. And also there's no room for feedback in most cases. And I think this kind of summarizes it really well, you know, how the customer explained it, how the project leader understood it, how the engineer designed, this is an interesting way of spelling designed it, how the programmer wrote it, and how the sales executive described it. Usually, people have different ideas of how they want the application to look. So in this case, if I had some sort of way that I could spin up an environment really quickly, show that to a customer, show that to a PM, show that to a fellow engineer, get the feedback and implement it on demand rather than waiting to get to staging, that would be really awesome. I'll get to that in a second. And there's finally, you know, the friction that we have between the environments as well. But the main thing I want to kind of like get you thinking about is like, okay, what if we were kind of on a more on-demand way able to test and take a look at these changes? So here's the fun part. I'm just curious, how many people out there are working with containers already? Kind of a show of hands. Okay, awesome. What about Kubernetes? Is anybody working with Kubernetes? Cool, a little less hands, but awesome. So containers, as I mentioned earlier, have changed a lot of the things that we can do as developers. It's reshaped the way that we build software, and it makes the operation part much easier for us. And it helps us kind of rethink the way that we did things before. So I'll start with kind of the basic impact of containers on CI/CD, and then I'll get a little bit more complex. So the very first and basic thing that we can do is that we can run every step of CI inside of a container. And as you know, when we work with containers, each time we run a new container, it's a fresh instance of that image. So we're almost completely eliminating the chances of new builds being impacted by a leftover build or previous builds. The example that I love to give here is, does everyone know what Blue Apron is? Like food, if you listen to podcasts, I'm sure you know what Blue Apron is. So Blue Apron is this food delivery service that basically sends you a box with the directions or the recipe on how to make it, plus all the ingredients. And I really like to think of containers like Blue Apron. It basically says, here's my application and everything that you need to run it, and here's the directions on how to run it. So kind of a Blue Apron-esque kind of way of thinking about your code. And you're isolating the builds, and you're giving a fresh container each time we rerun the build and compile the code. Oops, I skipped a slide here. There we go. Perfect. So the second aspect is that unit itself, that we move from one stage to another, that we hand off to operations or we deploy into production. It's a much more reliable and self-contained unit. So we know our Docker image has passed our unit tests, our integration tests, security, so on. And the likelihood of that Docker image suddenly exploding and not working the same that it did before is going to be a lot less likely. And the chances of kind of moving our code from one stage to another and having those kind of like explosion moments happen, not as frequent. And that's why Docker images are just a much more complete way of describing our application and describing our code. It's not only our code, but also what we need to run it, kind of this Blue Apron mentality. So zooming out a little bit more from the Docker image itself, one of the strong drivers of containers is the adoption of microservices. So containers have been built from day one to support microservices, and it has all the ways we can define the linkages between them, whether we're using Docker Compose or Kubernetes, Mesos. All of them have slightly different ways of describing our application and defining how it's working. So containers actually let us define our application much easier with one container or microservice, which ultimately allows us to clone our staging environment much more easily. So we can create a staging-like environment, see where these quotes come in here, a lot easier. So the reason I'm saying staging-like environment with the air quotes, it's because we have a rule that our staging environment has to be as identical as possible to what we have in production. So that's because there's still certain things we want to use our staging environment for. So let's say if we may want to do infrastructure tests. So let's say I'm running a retail website and I want to make sure that I can handle the extra customers on Black Friday. So I'm going to build a staging server that's as scalable as our production environment. And I can test that on our staging environment. But for other testing types, so let's say UI, integration, we don't necessarily need the scalability of what we have in production. We just need all the pieces of the application so we can work and test our features. So microservices really allow us to clone much earlier in the life cycle with a staging-like environment. And by using kind of these one-off environments like this, we have better test isolation. So we can test changes one at a time. And reiterating on sort of what I mentioned before about those frustrations of not being able to implement feedback a lot earlier, I'm able to implement it on demand and implement it then if I'm just able to spin something up and quickly bring it down. So that way, when it goes to staging, my feature works exactly how I intended it to. There's nothing holding me back from implementing them. By having this earlier in the process, I can share those environments with customers, I can share them with product owners, other stakeholders, and I can also start running a much broader set of tests earlier in this cycle. So you may be asking, well, we can't really have an environment exactly like the staging environment. How do we test performance much earlier? So the answer is, we run performance tests on these one-off environments and then track the performance over time. So we see over time that if the performance is slowing down and not going up, that can really be a way to trigger a reason to go back and revisit what you did and tackle it much earlier in the life cycle. So if we go back and kind of look at our staging environment, we see that these sets of tests can actually be moved over to the left. And there's really no reason to sort of stick to this way that we've been implementing CI and having the staging environment be the very first time that we're testing our code for these things. So the more we shift these to the left, the faster we're able to identify these issues, the less bottlenecks we have in production, the more streamlined our pipeline is, and we can push our code changes into production a lot earlier. Kind of this to the left mentality. This is the part where I throw in a Beyonce joke, of course, because she has that song to the left. So it's a GIF. It's not going to play, but oh, there we go. So like you can kind of think of moving all your testing to the left. If there's karaoke later, maybe we'll do a little rendition of Beyonce's to the left. Great. So last but not least, when we look at our Docker image here, it's a great revised way of looking at what our deliverables are. We're handing off that Docker image in a much more self-contained way. And if an issue is found in the Docker image versus a branch, if I rerun the same image with all the microservices, it's much easier to reproduce and to tackle that. So this is the same Git flow as we had before. We have the feature branch, we have master, we have staging. But if we're working on the feature branch, there's really nothing holding us back from provisioning a node and then to do that sort of in an automated fashion with Docker Compose up or other kind of great open source projects that we have out there. So if you're unfamiliar with Docker Compose, it's a way of sort of zooming out from a single microservice and lets you define more than one microservice. And you kind of use volumes and all the networks between them to define that. So it's an abstract way of defining an application, and it allows you to get instances of your application on demand, which is exactly what we're looking for here. So Docker Compose, Docker Swarm are really great ways to kind of scale your application. Kubernetes is also a really great way to run containers and sort of have different ways of describing it. I know there are a couple Kubernetes users out here. So a lot of these technologies allow you to describe how your application is running much earlier in the life cycle. So a running environment of my feature branch and everything around it. So I can send a link to my team, and I can kind of get feedback on that and incorporate it much earlier. And we can do that in an automatic way. So not only can a developer kind of spin up and share that environment with a team, we can embed it in our continuous integration script. So we can basically compose, kind of put our Docker Compose unit together, spin that up, run the tests, and then break it down. So next, I kind of mentioned that some Docker container technologies and orchestrations out there, you can go and implement this yourself. Maybe some of you have or are sort of currently working on a way of doing this. And you can absolutely use the scripts to provision a node with a Docker daemon or clusters in Kubernetes and monitor them. But I'm just going to show you real quick a way on how you can set up your pipeline and how you can kind of think about this and run all those steps in your pipeline. So this is hopefully the Wi-Fi. Everyone do a moment of silence for Wi-Fi, because I'm going to do a live demo here. So I'm going to use this repo here. It's a really simple Node.js application with the Mongo database. And I'm going to build my image, create a composition, spin up a pre-staging environment, add tests. I'm probably not going to get to the deploy to Kubernetes part of this today, but if you want me to kind of walk you through that later, I have a really simple way of doing that. And just kind of automate the whole thing here and be able to spin up that pre-staging environment. So let me just get my stuff set up here. Let's see. I am going to mirror my display and go here. Okay. So I'm just going to add my repository here. As I mentioned, this is a Node.js application with a Mongo database. So I'm going to add my repo. And so my application has a Docker file, so I'm going to go ahead and select Docker file here. And I've just logged in with my GitHub account, so it's kind of taking care of all of that on the back end for me. So it found my Docker file. As you know, some repos can have more than one Docker file. This is just confirming that I have the same one. And I'm going to go ahead and build my image. So the first time that I build this, it'll probably take a minute or two. Second time, it's going to be super fast. And that's sort of the beauty of Docker. If you haven't worked with Docker before, it's a whole copy on write system. So anytime that you're doing your CI/CD, you're not having to build from the ground up. You're really only having to add each additional layer on there. Oh no. OK, let's see. Let me try this again. Might be the Wi-Fi here. Live repo. Oop. There we go, adding my Docker file, create and build. All right, so while that's sort of loading here, so these are all the builds that I've built personally myself. If I hop over here to the CodeFresh one, you would see everybody at CodeFresh and every single build from everyone on my team. These are my images, so this is where all the images live, as well as all of the metadata for those images. Compositions. So compositions we use in two ways, and that's sort of this idea of that pre-staging environment. I can either spin up a pre-staging environment, it'll pop out a link for me, and I can just share that to anyone on my team, and that's really easy to bring up and shut down. Or we can do it, as I mentioned before, to run unit tests and integration tests up against that. My environments live here, obviously, and let's see how we're doing. Did it work? Perfect. So this just built my image for me. So what I'm going to do next is create a composition. So I'm going to call this demo chat. And if you haven't worked with containers or Docker before, this will give you kind of an interesting visualization of that sort of recipe, Blue Apron kind of mentality here. So you can have a file in your repo. Usually people use Docker Compose. We have templates in our personal app, but I'll just show you kind of a visualization of what I'm talking about here. So I want to add my repo. And you'll see as I add each of these things, it's kind of printing out this recipe on the right-hand side. And I need that to run on port 5000. So I'm really describing how I want my application to run. And the whole reason that I'm creating this composition is I want to run Mongo and my application together to be able to, A, have that pre-stage environment, or B, add it as part of my CI. So I'll go ahead and save that. Cool. And then if I take a look at my image here, I've got all of my details on my image, my Docker file, my logs, the layers. But I'm going to launch, well, I can launch it as a standalone, but why am I going to do that? I'm not going to have my database. But I can launch that composition that I just made before. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that. So I really, like, the best example that I like to give of this is I wouldn't want to come up and speak in front of all you lovely people without getting some rehearsals in. And then maybe that's the former actress in me here, which is the irony of this talk being about the staging environment and being on a stage. But sorry for the dad joke, you guys. It was right there. I had to do it. But much like, you know, I want to be able to really take a look at my code and get feedback on it and be able to implement that feedback. And that's really how I view these pre-staging environments. So this link right here, I can go ahead and click that. I personalized it for you guys. Woo! So this is my application just up and running. This is not in a staging environment. This is just running on CodeFresh, and this is how we've built it to kind of play around with that. But also, if I, for example, wanted to make it part of my CI, so I can make a CodeFresh YAML, which is going to be kind of like an advanced version of that, where I can go in and write in all the specifics. But I could just go into my UI here and say, okay, cool, I want to do an npm test, and I want to run that up against my composition. So I'll select the composition that I made before. I can push that to the Docker registry if I want. We also have our own internal one, so I'll save that, and I'll build it. So what this is doing, in just a second, is this is going to spin up that pre-staged environment for me, run any unit tests, integration tests that I've added in there, and then bring it back down and basically give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down on if it worked. Let's see, this will probably take a second here. So it's building my Docker image, and then it's going to run the test against it, Wi-Fi willing. Okay, successfully pushed my Docker image. So all of these layers already exist within CodeFresh, so we're not having to build those again. And now we're going to run those unit tests up against it. So this is just a really great way of not having to really wait on that staging environment to, like, basically be able to run all those tests that we've been waiting to do till the very end to do it a lot earlier, so our code is a lot clean and ready to go. So if I go to my builds, cool, it passed all the stuff. I have a quick little visual for you guys. Let's see if I can find it. Go to my display settings here. Cool. I'm going to turn off this and go here. So here's a fun little visualization of all of that. 1 second, cool. Well, Beyonce, of course, to the left. If I hadn't pushed it in your brain already. So here's a fun little visualization of this talk from DevOps Day, DFW, that we did, that I'm just going to leave up here kind of as I'm leaving the stage. But I'm happy to talk about sort of the idea of moving all these things to the left and how you can implement that yourself, or if you want to talk about using it with CodeFresh. And thank you so much for having me, Kansas City, and I'm happy to talk later.